Hi there. Let your mind slow down and relax your body. We aim to be calm and peaceful. And please, in the comments, write down your best help for sleeping and let me know where you are from. And never forget that you are loved and important in this world to somebody. You are unique and we love you. The Lantern Keeper. My grandfather's property bordered a vast marshland, a place he often warned me to stay away from. He called it the Sunken Woods, a tangled expanse of dead trees and thick, muddy paths that seemed to lead nowhere. As a child, I was terrified of it. But as I grew older, my curiosity began to outweigh my fear. One fall evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I ventured out toward the edge of the marsh. The air was cool, and a faint mist curled over the ground, giving the trees an otherworldly appearance. I told myself I wouldn't go far, just enough to see what was beyond the first few rows of trees. The marsh was eerily quiet, the only sound the soft squelch of mud beneath my boots. The deeper I went, the heavier the air seemed to become, pressing against my chest like a warning. Just as I was about to turn back, I saw it. A faint glow in the distance, like the flicker of a lantern. At first, I thought it was someone else exploring the marsh, but as I stepped closer, the light didn't move. It hovered, flickering faintly, as though it were waiting for me. I called out, but my voice felt swallowed by the thick air. As I approached, I saw a figure standing beneath a dead tree. He held the lantern in one hand, its golden light casting strange, shifting shadows on his face. He was tall and gaunt, his clothes tattered and soaked with mud. His face was pale, his eyes dark and hollow. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low and rough, like the creak of old wood. I was just exploring," I stammered, taking a step back. His head tilted slightly, his expression unreadable. "This place is not for you," he said. "Turn back before it's too late." The light from the lantern dimmed, and for a moment, the marsh around us was plunged into darkness. When it flared back to life, the man was gone. I ran, stumbling over roots and sinking into the mud, the faint glow of the lantern lingering in the corner of my vision. By the time I reached the edge of the marsh, the mist had thickened, and the trees seemed closer, their skeletal branches reaching toward me. When I told my grandfather what had happened, his face grew pale. "The Lantern Keeper," he whispered, almost to himself. "You're lucky he let you go." He refused to say anything more, but I didn't need him to. I stayed far away from the marsh after that, but sometimes, late at night, I see the faint flicker of a lantern in the distance, and I know he's still there, watching. The Visitor in the Window. When I was 10, my family moved into a farmhouse in the middle of nowhere. It was an old, creaky place with wide wooden floors and windows that rattled whenever the wind blew. At first, I loved it. The wide open fields, the sense of space, it felt like an adventure. But then I started noticing the window. My room faced the back of the house, overlooking the fields that stretched out for miles. There was nothing out there. No trees or buildings, just endless grass swaying in the wind. And yet, every night, I would see someone standing outside my window. At first, I thought it was my imagination. I'd wake up in the middle of the night and catch a glimpse of a shadowy figure standing in the field, its outline barely visible in the moonlight. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, that the swaying grass was creating shapes that weren't really there. But the figure kept appearing. Every night, it was closer. First at the edge of the field, then halfway across. By the end of the first week, it was standing just a few feet from the house, staring up at my window. Its form was indistinct, like a shadow, but I could feel its eyes on me. I told my parents, but they didn't believe me. My dad even went out into the field one night with a flashlight, but he found nothing. "It's just your imagination," he said. "There's no one out there." But the next night, the figure was closer. I started sleeping with the curtains closed, but that didn't help. I could still feel it watching me, its presence pressing against the thin glass. The air in my room grew colder, and sometimes I'd hear faint tapping on the window, like fingernails brushing against it. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I woke to the sound of tapping and, against my better judgment, pulled back the curtain. The figure was standing directly outside the window, its face level with mine. It wasn't human. Its features were sharp and angular, its eyes empty pits of darkness. Its mouth twisted into a wide, unnatural grin, revealing teeth that were too long and too sharp. It raised a hand, pressing its fingers against the glass, and the window began to frost over, the cold seeping into the room. I screamed, scrambling out of bed and running to my parents' room. By the time they got to my room, the figure was gone, but the frost on the window remained. We moved out a few months later. My parents never talked about what happened, and I stopped asking. But sometimes, when I'm lying in bed, I hear faint tapping on the window, and I can't help but wonder if it followed me. The Whispering Well. There was an old well behind my grandmother's house that she always warned me to avoid. "It's dangerous," she'd say, her voice trembling slightly. "And it's not just the fall you should fear." As a child, I found her warnings vague and overly dramatic. The well was ancient, its crumbling stone sides overgrown with moss, a rusted metal grate covering the opening. It was the kind of thing that seemed more like a relic than a danger. But as I got older, I began to notice the way my grandmother avoided even looking at it, and the unease in her voice whenever she spoke about it. The first time I heard the whispers, I was 13. It was a hot summer afternoon, and I was playing in the backyard. The air was still, the heat oppressive. I had wandered near the well, tracing my fingers over the rough stone, when I heard it. Faint, distant whispers, like voices carried on the wind. I froze, glancing around. The yard was empty, my grandmother inside baking as usual. I leaned closer, the whispers growing clearer. They weren't random. They were saying my name. "Ella! Ella!" My blood ran cold. I stumbled back, tripping over a root and landing hard on the ground. The whispers stopped instantly, leaving the air heavy with silence. I told my grandmother what I'd heard, expecting her to laugh it off or tell me I was imagining things. Instead, her face went pale. "You didn't answer them, did you?" she asked, her voice trembling. I shook my head, too shocked to speak. "Good," she said, gripping my shoulders tightly. "You must never answer. No matter what they say, no matter what they promise, you stay away from that well." I tried to heed her warning, but the whispers didn't stop. Every time I went into the backyard, they called to me, soft and pleading. Sometimes they sounded like my own voice. Other times they sounded like my grandmother's. They promised things, secrets, treasures, knowledge. If only I would come closer. If only I would answer. One night, unable to resist any longer, I snuck outside with a flashlight. The yard was eerily quiet, the air cool and still. I crept toward the well, the beam of my flashlight casting long shadows across the ground. The whispers started as soon as I was within a few feet. "Ella, come closer." My heart pounded as I stepped up to the grate, shining my flashlight down into the darkness. The light didn't reach the bottom, but I saw movement, something shifting deep within the shadows. A pale, skeletal hand reached up, its fingers curling around the edge of the grate. I screamed, dropping the flashlight as I stumbled backward. The hand vanished, and the whispers turned into guttural growls, rising in intensity until I thought the sound would drive me mad. The next thing I remember, I was inside, my grandmother holding me tightly as I sobbed into her shoulder. The well was boarded up the next day, and I was forbidden from going near it again. Years later, after my grandmother passed away, I returned to the house to sort through her belongings. The well was still there, the boards rotting and the grate rusted nearly to dust. As I stood there, staring at it, the whispers started again. This time, I ran. The mirror room. The old mansion where I worked as a housekeeper was filled with strange quirks, hidden passageways, doors that led nowhere, and a library so large it felt like it could swallow you whole. But the strangest feature of all was the mirror room. It was tucked away on the third floor, a narrow chamber lined with mirrors of all shapes and sizes. The mirrors were ancient, their glass clouded and warped, their frames ornately carved with symbols I didn't recognize. The room had a suffocating quality, the air always cold, no matter the time of year. My employer, Mrs. Adair, was a frail old woman who rarely left her bedroom. "The mirror room is off limits," she told me the day I started. "You're not to enter it under any circumstances." I nodded, not thinking much of it. The house was enormous, and there were plenty of other rooms to clean. But as the weeks passed, my curiosity grew. I couldn't stop thinking about the mirror room, wondering why it was forbidden. One rainy afternoon, while Mrs. Adair was asleep, I decided to take a look. The door was unlocked, and it opened with a soft creak, revealing the dimly lit chamber. The mirrors reflected the faint light, their warped surfaces creating strange, distorted images. I stepped inside, the air growing colder with each step. My reflection stared back at me from every angle. But something about it was wrong. The faces in the mirrors didn't quite match mine. They moved slightly out of sync, their expressions shifting in ways I couldn't control. As I approached the largest mirror at the far end of the room, I noticed something else. One of the reflections wasn't mine. It stood behind me, a figure tall and thin, its face pale and featureless. My breath caught in my throat as I turned, expecting to see someone in the room. But there was no one there. When I looked back at the mirror, the figure was closer. Its hand reached out, pressing against the glass, and the surface began to ripple like water. I ran, slamming the door behind me and locking it. Mrs. Adair didn't ask why I refused to go near the third floor after that, and I didn't tell her. But sometimes when I passed by the door, I saw faint smudges on the glass of the mirrors, like fingerprints pressing from the other side. The grinning stranger. It happened when I was 15, staying at my mom's house for the weekend. It was just the two of us, as my parents were divorced, and my mom worked late hours. That night she was already asleep while I stayed up in the living room, wrapped in a blanket, watching TV. The clock read 12:30 a.m., and the world outside the windows was silent. My mom's house wasn't in the safest part of town, but it was nestled far enough from the road to give an illusion of security. I often left the curtains open, enjoying the soft glow of streetlights filtering through the room. It was a habit I didn't think much about until that night. As I watched the screen, a movement caught my eye from the window nearest me, just 4 feet away. I turned my head, my heart skipping a beat, and saw a man's face staring back at me. He was smiling. It wasn't the kind of smile you'd see in friendly conversation or a passing stranger's nod of acknowledgement. This was something else entirely. A wide, almost unnatural grin that stretched his features into a grotesque mask of malice. For a moment, I froze, locked in a silent exchange of stares with this stranger. Then panic set in. I jumped up, intending to run to my mom's room, but my foot slammed against the edge of the coffee table. Pain shot through my leg, and I crumpled to the floor, gasping. Scrambling to my feet, I yelled for my mom, my voice trembling with terror. She came rushing in, still groggy, but alert enough to understand my stammered words. "There's a man at the window." Before she could process what I was saying, a new sound filled the air, the distinct rattle of someone attempting to open the front door. The locked doorknob jiggled violently, and my mom and I both froze, staring at the door as if sheer willpower could keep it shut. Then her face changed, going pale as realization dawned. "The back door," she whispered. She bolted through the house, her bare feet thudding against the wooden floor as she rushed to the kitchen. I followed her, my injured leg slowing me down as she reached the back door just in time to slam the deadbolt into place. We backed away, our breaths coming in shallow gasps. Outside, the shadow of a figure moved, pausing just beyond the frosted glass of the kitchen door. The handle turned once, then again, before the door shook under the force of a solid kick. "I've got a bat!" my mom yelled, her voice filled with a ferocity I'd never heard before. "I'll kill you if you try to come in here. The police are on their way." The shadow froze. For a few agonizing seconds, the only sound was the pounding of my heart in my ears. Then, slowly, the figure turned and vanished into the night. We stood in the middle of the kitchen, clutching each other as the minutes crawled by. My mom gripped her baseball bat so tightly her knuckles turned white. When the police finally arrived, their flashlights swept through the yard, revealing trampled flowers and a pile of cigarette butts beneath the living room window. The same window where I'd first seen the man. "He was watching," one of the officers muttered grimly, scanning the yard for any further signs. They took my description, but admitted there wasn't much they could do unless he returned. He never did, or at least, not while we were still living there. My mom moved a year later, despite no further incidents. The memory, though, lingered like a shadow over my life. To this day, I can't bring myself to live in a house with ground floor windows. High-rise apartments feel safer, their distance from the street a fragile but comforting barrier. And like my mom, I keep a baseball bat under my bed, just in case. The sound in the basement. My grandfather's house had always felt eerie to me, even as a kid. It wasn't haunted in the Hollywood sense. No poltergeists throwing furniture or creepy ghost children singing nursery rhymes. It was just the kind of place where shadows lingered too long, where floorboards creaked even when no one was walking, and where every noise seemed louder than it should have been. The basement was the worst part. My grandfather used it as a workshop, filling it with old tools, half-finished projects, and shelves crammed with jars of screws and nails. It always smelled like sawdust and damp concrete. The single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling barely lit the space, leaving the corners shrouded in darkness. I avoided it whenever I could. But one summer, when I was staying with him during school break, I had no choice but to go down there. He'd asked me to grab a wrench from his workbench while he tinkered with the lawnmower outside. I hesitated at the top of the stairs, staring down into the gloom, before mustering the courage to descend. The stairs groaned under my weight, the sound echoing through the basement. I flipped the light switch at the bottom, but the bulb only flickered weakly before dying completely. Great, I muttered, pulling out my phone to use as a flashlight. The beam of light swept over the cluttered workbench, catching the dull gleam of the wrench. As I reached for it, I heard it, a faint rhythmic tapping coming from the far corner of the basement. I froze, the wrench slipping from my fingers and clattering to the floor. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate, like someone was drumming their fingers on the concrete wall. My flashlight beam darted toward the corner, but the light didn't reach far enough to illuminate whatever was there. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. The tapping stopped. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, the silence pressing against my ears. Just as I began to convince myself it had been my imagination, the sound started again, closer this time. The tapping turned into a low, guttural whisper, too faint for me to make out the words. The air grew colder, and my flashlight flickered, the beam dimming. I took a step back, my pulse hammering in my ears. Then I saw it. A shape moved in the darkness, low to the ground, its limbs impossibly long and thin. It skittered across the floor like a spider, its movements jerky and unnatural. I stumbled backward, barely managing to stay on my feet as I bolted up the stairs. I slammed the basement door shut, locking it with trembling hands. My grandfather found me minutes later, pale and shaking. I tried to explain what I'd seen, but he dismissed it as a trick of the light, a combination of shadows and my overactive imagination. I refused to go back down there for the rest of the summer. My grandfather laughed it off, but I noticed he started locking the basement door at night, something he'd never done before. Years later, after he passed away, the house was sold to a new family. I sometimes wonder if they've heard the tapping yet, or if they've seen the thing that lurks in the shadows. Part of me hopes they haven't, but another part of me knows it's only a matter of time. The street light. There's a street light at the end of my block that doesn't work like it should. Most of the others flicker occasionally or hum faintly when they've been on too long. This one, though, doesn't hum or flicker. It turns off completely whenever someone walks beneath it. The first time I noticed, I was walking home late from a friend's house. The neighborhood was quiet, the air cool and crisp. I saw the street light ahead, glowing faintly against the darkness, and thought nothing of it. But as soon as I stepped under it, the light went out. I stopped, glancing up at the darkened bulb. A second later, the light flickered back on, illuminating the empty street. I laughed nervously, chalking it up to bad wiring, and kept walking. It happened again the next time I passed by, and the time after that. The light always went out the moment I was directly beneath it, plunging the street into brief, unsettling darkness. I started avoiding that part of the block, taking a longer route home to avoid the streetlight. But one night, after a late shift at work, I was too tired to care. I trudged toward it, ignoring the uneasy feeling curling in my stomach. As expected, the light went out as I passed beneath it. But this time, it didn't come back on. The darkness felt heavy, pressing against me like a weight. I turned, squinting into the shadows, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing just beyond the glow of the next streetlight. It was tall and thin, its outline barely visible in the faint light. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the stillness. The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, motionless, its head tilted slightly to one side. My pulse quickened as I backed away, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. Then the figure moved. It took a single step forward, and the streetlight above it went out. I ran. My feet pounded against the pavement as I sprinted toward my house, the streetlights flickering out one by one behind me. By the time I reached my front door, my chest was heaving, and my hands shook as I fumbled with the keys. I didn't look back until I was inside. The door locked and bolted. The street outside was dark, every street light on the block extinguished. The light at the end of the street works normally now, or so I've been told. But I still avoid that block at night. And when I see the faint glow of the streetlight in the distance, I can't help but feel like something is waiting beneath it, just out of sight.